Nobody talks about the side entrance. That's the thing, basically, about Windsor. The parts the tourists photograph are never the parts where anything real happens. The real things happen in the corridors that don't have names. The ones lined with portraits of people who've been dead for 200 years and don't seem particularly bothered about it. The ones with carpet worn thin at the center from decades of footsteps that never made the news. I was standing in one of those corridors on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I want to tell you exactly what I saw, not what I heard secondhand, not what circulated later, the version that got softer and more diplomatic with each retelling until it barely resembled itself. What I actually saw. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I had a reason to be there. A legitimate, documented, cleared through 3 departments reason. And because of that reason, I was standing 12 feet from a moment that most people in that building have since quietly agreed not to discuss. The morning had started the way Windsor mornings do in autumn. Cold pressing in from every window, the kind of cold that has opinions. The grounds outside were doing that thing where the mist sits low over the grass and doesn't burn off until nearly noon, and the tourists at the main gate were doing what tourists always do, huddled in their coats, phones raised, hoping the guards would flinch. They never flinch. Plus, that's the whole point. I'd arrived through the staff entrance on the east side. She signed in with a woman named Margaret, who had the energy of someone who'd seen everything twice. Found it mildly, actually, disappointing both times, and made my way up through the back passages toward the secondary drawing room where I was meant to be. The castle was busier than usual. Not publicly, basically, busy. The public-facing rooms were as controlled and staged as always. But internally there was a current running through the staff, the kind of low-frequency tension you feel in your back teeth before you can articulate what it's. People, I mean, were moving with slightly more purpose than necessary. Conversations stopped a beat too early when someone new entered a room. I, for what it's worth, noticed it, but didn't think much of it. Royal households have their own barometric pressure, and their weather changes for reasons that never get announced. I honestly was 20 feet from the corridor junction when I heard the first voice. I want to be careful here, not careful in the way that protects anyone. That ship, as they say, has sailed. Careful in the way that stays honest. I'm not going to dress this up with more drama than it had. What I heard was a voice. One voice. And then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel significant, another. The first voice was Camilla's. I recognized it immediately. That particular register, crisp and private school rounded but with something underneath it that's always struck me as genuinely tired. Kind of, not bored. Tired. The way a person sounds when they've been performing a version of themselves for so many years that even the performance has started to wear at the seams. She was saying something I couldn't fully catch from my position. The acoustics in those corridors are odd. Sound travels in patches, bounces off the portraits, gets swallowed by the carpet. What I caught were fragments, a word here and a phrase there. Not the appropriate time. And then the register shifted, sharpened, and, "Charlotte, I am speaking to you, and I expect—" I stopped walking. Not a dramatic stop. Just the natural pause of someone who suddenly understands they've wandered into the edge of something private. I stood very still and looked at the portrait nearest to me. Duke, 17th century, wearing an expression that suggested he also knew when to keep quiet. What you have to understand about Princess Charlotte is this. She's a small person in the way young people are sometimes made small by institutions. You'd think she might be. The protocols, the training, the constant management of public image that starts before you can properly read. You'd think all of that would produce a kind of careful, contained blankness, a person who has learned to take up less space. I think it doesn't. It produced someone who takes up exactly the space she intends to. I'd been in the same room as her twice before that morning, briefly, incidentally. Both times I'd noticed the same thing. A quality of attention that felt paradoxically both young and ancient. Like, well, yes, someone who learned very early that watching carefully was its own form of power. She was 14 then. 14 and standing in a corridor that smelled of beeswax and old silk, and the second voice I heard was hers. Quiet. Steady. I understand what you're saying. A pause. I simply don't agree. The air in that corridor changed. I don't know how else to put it. It just changed, and pressure differential. The kind of shift you feel right before lightning. I was looking at the Duke in the portrait, and the Duke wasn't helping me. I heard Camilla's voice again. Lower this time, which is always the more dangerous register. When voices go basically quiet in confrontations, that's when they mean it. I didn't catch the full sentence. I caught enough. Your father would want you to consider. And that's when the door at the end of the corridor opened. He came through it the way guards move when they're not on ceremonial duty. Purposeful, quiet, contained, no bearskin, no rigid parade posture. He was in working uniform, a tall man with the particular kind of stillness that people develop when their job requires them to be invisible for hours at a stretch and present in an instant. His name, I learned later, was Sergeant Alan Price. Honestly, 12 years of service. 2 deployments before the household assignment. The kind of record that doesn't make headlines because it was never designed to. He was doing a routine corridor check. Plus, door to door, passage to passage, the unglamorous infrastructure of royal security. He came through the door, took 3 steps, and stopped. He'd heard what I'd heard, which his eyes moved, just fractionally, the way trained people's eyes move, to assess, to calculate. And for a moment he simply stood there, and in that moment I watched something happen in his face that I've thought about many times since. Not decision exactly. More like recognition. The look of a person who sees a thing clearly and understands that seeing it clearly means they can't pretend otherwise. He walked forward. Not toward Camilla. Not away. Directly into, honestly, the junction of the corridor, into the space between them, and he said, loudly enough that there was no possible ambiguity about who could hear, I beg your pardon, Your Majesty. There's been a request for you in the East drawing room. Immediate, they said. Flat. Polite. Not utterly unapologetic. There was a silence that lasted approximately 1 geological age. Then, well, Camilla said, is there? Not a question. The thing people say when they're deciding. Plus, yes, ma'am. Another silence, shorter this time. I heard footsteps, even measured, not hurried. The sound of someone who has decided to be gracious about a situation that has presented them with no real alternative. The footsteps receded. I looked at the Duke in the portrait. The Duke looked back. Neither of us said anything. When I finally moved again and reached the corridor junction, Sergeant Price was standing alone at parade rest, eyes forward, looking at nothing in particular with the serene focus of a man who has absolutely nothing on his conscience and intends to keep it that way. Princess Charlotte was standing 6 feet away. Heck, she wasn't doing anything remarkable. She wasn't crying. She wasn't visibly shaken. She was standing like, with her hands at her sides, looking at a point somewhere on the middle distance, and her expression was, I keep coming back to this word, composed. TBH, not blank. Composed. Those are different things. Blank is absence. Composed is pretty much something you build, deliberately out of whatever materials you have available. She looked at Price, and he looked forward. She said, very quietly, the words not really meant to carry, thank you. He said nothing. His eyes didn't move. His face didn't change. Plus, but something in his posture shifted. Barely. The way a tree shifts when a wind passes through it. Still standing exactly where it stood, but acknowledging in the only language available to it that it felt the weather. That's where part 1 ends, which not with an explanation, not with a neat resolution, and just a 14-year-old girl in a cold corridor in October, and a soldier who decided, in one quiet, irreversible moment, that his job description meant something more than standing still. Some rooms you walk out of differently than you walked in. That corridor was one of them. I know because I couldn't walk out of it without looking back, and when I did, they were still standing there. The princess. The sergeant. In that strange, shared silence of people who have just, without intending to, witnessed something true about each other. The Duke in the portrait watched all of this with his usual 17th-century patience. He'd seen this before, probably. He always had the same face about it. In royal households. There's no such thing as a private moment. There's only the illusion of one, maintained by the collective, silent agreement of everyone who works in the building, the footmen who don't glance up, the housekeepers who reroute their path when voices rise, the security staff who develop a professional relationship with strategic deftness. It isn't deception exactly. It's more like the institutional version of looking away from something bright so you don't damage your vision. What happened in that corridor in October broke the agreement. Not loudly, not scandalously, not in the way that feeds tabloids or ends careers. It broke the way old ice breaks, a sound, a crack, and then a quality of silence that's different from the silence before. And by 6 o'clock that evening, and in the staff dining room 2 floors below where Charlotte's rooms overlooked the East Garden, everyone in the building knew something had happened. Nobody knew exactly what. But they knew. I ate dinner that night at the far end of the long table, next to a woman named Dorothea, who'd worked in Windsor's textile conservation unit for 19 years and had the professional instincts of a very old cat. She knew every atmospheric shift in the building before it fully materialized. I once saw her redirect a junior staff member away from a particular hallway with no explanation other than a short, decisive headshake. And the very next minute, a private family argument had spilled briefly and loudly into that exact hallway before retreating again behind closed doors. She knew. I think. I sat down across from me that evening with her tray and said without looking up, "I heard there was a thing in the South Corridor." I said, "I didn't know anything about that." She looked at me over her glasses with the expression of someone who has heard that particular sentence approximately 10,000 times. "Right," she kind of said, and began eating her soup with the serenity of a person who's never needed confirmation to know what's true. The dining room filled the way it always did, gradually, in clusters, people sitting with their usual people, the professional self-segregation of any large building. Estate staff at one end, household staff in the middle, security and grounds at the other end. The, categories blurred at the edges but held at the center. Price came in at 6:20, and he got his plate at the serving counter, nodded to 2 men near the window, and sat at the security end of the table. He didn't look like a man who'd done anything notable. He had the careful normality of someone who is deliberately not performing careful normality. The real thing, not the performance. He was tired, which he was hungry. He ate, which I watched him the way you watch something you're still trying to understand. He, didn't look up once to scan the room for reactions, didn't check whether anyone was watching. This, I'd come to understand, was the most telling thing about him. People who've done something they're uncertain about check to see how it's landing. Price didn't check. Whatever calculation he'd run in that corridor, he'd run it completely. And the answer had been simple enough that it didn't require monitoring. The conversation, I guess, at my end of the table turned, as it sometimes did, to the subject of palace protocol. Basically, and this wasn't, I think, entirely coincidental, to the question of when a royal protection officer or household security staff is obligated to intervene versus when they're obligated to absent themselves. It was Dorothea who steered it there, casually, the way she steered everything. "There's a distinction," she said, setting down her fork, "between intervening in a personal matter and intervening in a duty of care matter. The first isn't like your business. The second very much is." A man named Gerald, who worked in the grounds department and had very strong opinions about everything, said, "Bit of a gray area, isn't it?" "Well, when one becomes the other." "It isn't gray," said Dorothea. "People basically make it gray because the gray is more comfortable, but it isn't. You know, when you're there, in the moment, with the information you have, you know." Nobody argued with her. She picked her fork back up. "The only real question," she said, "is whether you act on what you know. That's where people get lost." And honestly, I thought about Price's face in the moment before he walked forward. That recognition I'd seen, it hadn't looked like bravery exactly. Bravery tends to look effortful. I think, person overriding fear, overriding instinct, making themselves do the thing they're afraid to do. What I'd seen in Price's face wasn't that. It was simpler, plainer. It looked like clarity. The look of someone who had assessed the situation. He found that the answer was obvious and moved. The thing he'd assessed, I've turned it over many times. He hadn't intervened in a family dispute. He hadn't corrected a senior royal or inserted himself into a private matter between relations. He'd done something specific and narrower than that. He'd created an exit, given a face-saving reason to disengage, protected a young member of the family from a moment that was, by any measure, longer than it needed to be. Charlotte was 14 and she was alone in that corridor. And the conversation wasn't softening, and that's what he'd assessed. That's what was obvious. Plus, after dinner, I walked back through the building the long way, which took me past the secondary staircase near the east wing. Charlotte was there, and I mean, she was on the landing, which is a semi-public space. And she was sitting on the window seat looking out at the grounds, which were by then properly dark, the mist replaced by a clear, cold sky that showed an improbable number of stars. She was in clothes that looked like she'd changed out of whatever official thing she'd been wearing earlier. A jumper. Plus, socks. She looked for a moment approximately her age. She had a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading it. I walked past. "This is the protocol. You do. Not address. You do not engage unless addressed. You move through." I moved through. Plus, as I passed the landing, she said, not looking up, not turning from the window, "Did you see it? In the corridor this morning?" I stopped. There's no good answer to that question, which there's no protocol that covers it. I stood for a moment in the particular awkwardness of a situation that has exceeded its own instruction manual. "I was nearby," I said, carefully, which was true. She nodded once, still looking at the stars. "He didn't have to do that," she said. I said nothing, and people always think that doing nothing is the neutral choice, she said. It isn't. Doing nothing is still a choice. It just has the advantage of not being visible. She turned a page in the book she wasn't reading. "He made it visible," she said. "That's the I think thing." I walked the rest of the way back through the building thinking about that. Doing nothing is still a choice. It just has the advantage of not being visible. 14, and she'd already anatomized it better than most adults manage after years of trying. And there's a particular kind of loneliness that lives at the center of very public lives. Not the loneliness of being alone. She was never alone, not really, not in any practical sense. Something else. The loneliness of being in a room full of people who are professionally invested in not seeing things clearly. People who smooth and manage and redirect and collectively maintain the useful fiction that nothing is happening, because something is happening is inconvenient for everyone's assigned role. Price had declined to maintain the fiction. That was, I think, what she meant by visible. He'd made a choice that couldn't be unseen, couldn't be later reframed as neutral or absent or merely procedural. He'd stood in the corridor and said, in the most polite and procedurally correct terms available to him, "I see what's happening here. I am, I think, making it stop." In a building dedicated to the management, of appearances, that is a radical act. That night, from my temporary room on the 3rd floor, I lay awake longer than usual. The castle at night has a sound, not silence exactly, but the deep architectural settling of a very old building that's been holding itself together through an act of ongoing structural will for several centuries. Creaks, plus distant footsteps. The clocks, basically, which Windsor has more clocks than any building I've ever been in. They tick at slightly different rates, slightly different pitches, and at night you become aware of all of them, a whole building breathing in imperfect unison. I pretty much thought about Dorothea's words. The only real question is whether you act on what you know. And I thought about Charlotte on the window seat, stars in the glass, a book she wasn't reading. I thought about Price's posture shifting when she said thank you. That small, involuntary adjustment. The acknowledgement that passed between two people who had, in one unplanned moment, been stripped down to something true. He was a soldier standing a post. She, to be fair, was a princess navigating a world she'd been born into and never asked to join. Neither of them had a template for what had just happened between them, but something had happened, which something that didn't have a protocol. And in a building built entirely on protocols, that made it the most significant thing that had occurred all day. Tomorrow, part in my opinion, 3, and the part where things move. Mine where the silence that settles afterward is a different quality of silence entirely. The kind that means something has shifted, something irreversible and small and important, in the way that things shift, not in grand gestures, but in the tiny recalibrations of one person choosing to be honest when they could have chosen otherwise. Honestly, the clocks ticked. Windsor breathed. Outside, the stars were still doing their improbable thing. 3 days after it happened, Sergeant Alan Price was reassigned. I think, not punished, not reprimanded, not formally disciplined in any way that left a paper trail, because none of this had been formally acknowledged in any way that left a paper trail. He was simply moved. Different wing, different, honestly, rotation, which the kind of administrative adjustment that can mean anything or nothing, and in which in royal households almost always means something. I found out from Dorothea, who found out the way Dorothea found out everything, which was through a combination of institutional osmosis and 19 years of calibrated attention. She told me over morning tea on a Thursday, in the same tone she'd use, to report that the restoration supply order had been delayed. "Price is on the north wing now," she said. "West well, staircase rotation." I said, "Since when?" "Tuesday." I held my tea and thought about that. "Is he all right?" Dorothea looked at me with those over-the-glasses eyes. "He's where he's," she said. "That's what all right looks like in this building." Just my take. The North Wing isn't a demotion, technically. This is the important thing to understand about institutions. They don't punish with demotions. Demotions are legible. Demotions can be appealed, questioned, documented. Institutions that, I guess, have been running for centuries know better than that. I think they use geography instead. They use rotation. They use the slow, frictionless drift of assignment until a person finds themselves somewhere less central, managing something less visible, and the question of why is answered by nothing more articulable than operational requirements. Price knew this. Plus, anyone who'd worked in that building for more than 2 years knew this. He'd known it when he walked into the corridor. That's the part that sits with me. He'd done the math. The actual real-world math of what happens to people who make things visible in places dedicated to keeping things invisible. He'd done it, and he'd walked forward anyway. And he hadn't run the calculation wrong. He'd run it completely. He just arrived at a different bottom line than the institution expected. I saw him once more before I left Windsor. It was my last morning there, a Friday. The light doing that thing it does in late October when it comes in flat and golden and makes everything look like a painting of itself rather than the actual thing. I was in the East Passage heading toward the main exit with my bag. and he was coming the other direction. We hadn't spoken directly since the corridor. We had no particular reason to. He nodded as we passed, the efficient, pleasant nod of someone acknowledging a familiar face. I stopped. I said, "North Wing." He stopped too, looked at me with an expression that was entirely neutral and somehow, underneath the neutrality, entirely clear. "No good light up there this time of year," he said. I said, "I sort of imagined so." He said, "Better view of the grounds." We stood for a moment in the passage, in the flat October gold. I said, "For what it's worth." "It's worth," he said, "pretty much," before I finished. He kept walking. I kept walking, which we went in opposite directions, and I don't know that I'll see him again. Here is the thing about acts of quiet integrity in powerful institutions. They don't echo the way you'd want them to. There's no moment where the institution pauses and reconsiders. No acknowledgement. No formal recognition. The building absorbs them and continues. Because the building has been absorbing things for 300 years and will be absorbing things 300 years from now. Pretty much, that's what buildings do. What changes is smaller than that. What changes is, look, a 14-year-old girl sitting on a window seat in October, looking at stars, saying doing nothing is still a choice, and meaning it from somewhere deep and personal and already tested, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a thing she's just watched someone refuse to do. What changes is that she knows, which not abstractly, not theoretically, and to be fair, she knows because she saw it. She knows what it looks like. When someone runs the math and chooses the thing that costs them something, she'll carry that the way. You carry things that are given to you before you're old enough to know how important they are. Not as a lesson, not as a memory exactly, but as a calibration, a sense of what's possible. A data point for every future moment when she'll have to decide whether to make something visible or to maintain the fiction. She's going to have a lot of those moments. I've thought about whether to write any of this down. There's a version of this story that ends in my notes, private, unshared. Another entry in the thick institutional silence that covers these things like the mist over the Windsor grounds. There's a version where what I saw stays in the category of things that happened without ever becoming things that were said. I understand the logic of that version. Honestly, it protects people. It maintains professional boundaries. It respects the privacy of a family and the dignity of a young person who didn't ask to have her private corridor moment become anything. But there's something that bothers me about that version. What bothers me is Price. On a Tuesday morning, 3 days later, picking up his kit and walking to the North Wing with his full knowledge that he'd bought himself a lateral drift and not a day less. What bothers me is the way the building absorbed his act and moved on, frictionless and unmarked as if it hadn't happened, as if one man's clarity in one moment, his decision to be honest about what he was seeing, were simply another operational variable, reclassifiable and redirectable and smoothable away. He made it visible, she said. The least I can do is keep it visible. The last time I saw Windsor in the rearview mirror, metaphorically I was on the train, the mist was doing its morning thing again, low over the grounds, and the castle sitting in it with that particular combination of permanence and unreality that very old buildings project. Like it had been there before the concept of time and was politely indulging the rest of us by operating within it. I thought about corridors, the, ones that have names, and the ones that don't. The ones where the tourists stand and photograph the guards who won't flinch. Those long, ceremonial, red-coated disciplines of perfect stillness that everyone understands as performance, as theater, as the beautiful and ancient face that institutions show the world. And the ones where a sergeant in working uniform comes through a door on a Tuesday morning and makes a decision that the theater doesn't have a script for. Both are real. Both are Windsor. But only one of them, in my experience, and does anything worth the word stands. I don't, for what it's worth, know what Camilla's intention was that morning. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I heard fragments. I heard a register and a sharpness and the use of a father's name as use, but I don't know what came before I arrived, and I don't know what she was trying to accomplish, and it's possible, genuinely possible, that she was trying to help in a way that looked, from the outside, like the opposite of that. Families are complicated. Royal families are complicated in ways that don't have adequate comparison. The pressures, basically, the expectations, the constant management of both the private self and the public function. These are not things I can fully understand from the outside, and I don't pretend to. What I know is what I saw, a girl. He's standing alone. A man making a choice. An institution adjusting smoothly. And somewhere in there, in the space between those three facts, something that I've decided matters enough to say plainly. The guard who takes a stand in the corridor that doesn't have a name, who does it not for visibility or recognition or the story it will make later, but because the answer was obvious and required no monitoring, is doing something that the building will never frame as heroism, because heroism is the kind of word that creates liabilities and invites examination. But it's exactly that. Quiet, specific, irreversible. The kind of thing that 14-year-old girls remember when they're older and standing in their own corridors. Deciding whether to make something visible or to maintain the useful, comfortable, and well-practiced fiction that nothing is happening. She'll remember. I'm certain of it. The buildings forget. The people don't. That's the one thing 300 years of institutional carpet has never been able to muffle. Completely. The persistent, inconvenient memory of a single person choosing to act on what they know. It's enough. Plus, it always was.